Our opening words this morning are from David Bomba. We Unitarian Universalists are shaped by a common story rather than a common theology. A common story. And our chalice lighting this morning. Thank you, Robin. A flame within a chalice, a cup with a stem and a foot, is a primary symbol of the Unitarian Universalist faith tradition. Many of our congregations kindle a flaming chalice in gatherings and worships and feature the chalice symbol prominently in gatherings. Hans Deutsch, an Austrian artist, first brought together the chalice and the flame as a Unitarian symbol during his work with the Unitarian Service Committee, which worked to harbor refugees of the Nazi regime during World War II. To Deutsch, the image had connotations of sacrifice and love. Unitarian Universalists today have many different interpretations of the flaming chalice, including the light of reason, the warmth of community, and the flame of hope. Graduate of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities in 2015 and has been serving as our minister since August of 2015. I would have to say that my acquaintance with Karen goes back 25 years to shortly after she first came to Bismarck. I have been honored and privileged to know Karen and watch her grow up, so to speak. And couldn't be more delighted now than to be introducing her as our minister for today's service. Thank you.
When writing sermons, which are inevitably based on titles I chose the previous month for the previous month's newsletter deadline, I've noticed an inconvenient tendency to make bold claims that I have to live with and live into later on. For instance, top 10 UU stories of all time. So the trouble is, neither I, nor UUs, nor humanity in general has actually lived for all of time. Okay. The trouble is, I went back and counted. It's not really 10 at all. So the trouble is, there are lots of stories I don't even know yet. As Janice mentioned, I only graduated from seminary 2 years ago this past week. How do I know if I'm sharing the best of all possible stories? So the trouble now is, some of the people I'm going to tell you about, who we claim as ancestors of our tradition, never even heard the word Unitarian, they never heard the word Universalist, and they certainly never heard the concept Unitarian Universalist. Okay, now the trouble is, I've spent so much time with this introduction, I'm sure I won't have time to make stories of all the things that I want to share with you, and sometimes I'll just have to offer you bits and pieces of the best that I can do, of the mostly interesting stuff. So welcome. So I've come up with a new title that I think most traditions in the world could probably borrow if they want. Heretics, martyrs, peacemakers, radicals, and people who've let us down. A glimpse of our past. So I'd like to start in the 300s in the Roman Empire, though there are many places to start. So I don't know if you can see this cartoon. This is meant to be a person called Arius. And the caption says, well, I think that Jesus isn't really God. So this was about the 300s. So, have you ever heard this in its current form? Okay, the Nicene Creed. What you may not know is one of the main purposes of the Nicene Creed, which people gathered together in 325 CE to put together, was to sock it to Arius and the rest. And define what the faith is and also what it's not. So words like being of one substance with the Father, and then at the end, those who don't agree that Jesus is God are condemned by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That was actually in the original document. In fact, later on, when people did have the word Unitarian, an insult that was often slung was that they were Arians, with an I. That's a very important distinction. So, in his time, Arius was known as a heretic. He was exiled from the church, and then he was let back in. Then he got sick before he actually was able to come back into the church. There was a lot of that going on at the time, being exiled and coming back and exiled and coming back. All right, here's somebody else. Origen. He lived a couple hundred years earlier. Origen is often claimed as an ancestor of Universalism because even at this very early date, and especially at this very early date, he believed in what he called final restoration, which means after all is said and done, everybody gets to heaven. Well, that was a very controversial view. The orthodoxy said that you're at risk of eternal damnation if you don't do what you're supposed to do, and the orthodoxy, frankly, knew what you were supposed to do. So, at this time, the word universalist, as I mentioned, wasn't used. This term was. Interestingly, in the passage of time, this term has also been used. He's claimed as a church father, even now. So, as I said, exiled, come back, exiled, come back. We continue to be human beings throughout history. All right, so now let's leap ahead 1,000 years. It might be exhausting to leap 1,000 years, but here we go. This is an image of Michael Servetus. He is strongly claimed as an ancestor of Unitarianism, though he also didn't use that word. And he boldly claimed that the Trinity was literally a doctrine invented by the devil. He felt it was invented by the devil because it was so hard to wrap your mind around. He thought it made your Christian faith wobble because it was too much of a leap to believe. As you might imagine, he was sought in the Spanish Inquisition, and he was on the move. You might not know that he also became an enemy of John Calvin. And Calvin never accused him of being a Unitarian. Nobody knew that word at the time. But this word is indeed what Michael Servetus became. So in John Calvin's Geneva, Michael Servetus was burned at the stake for his challenge to the Trinity, and fodder was his books. They were strapped to him. There were those who reacted at the time the way we are reacting now. One of these people, said this, Sebastian Castillo, "To burn a man is not to defend a doctrine, it is to burn a man." So now I'm going to give your hearts a break. Let's move away from Geneva into Transylvania. This is a person I want to remember and note. I didn't know until I went to seminary that there was a Unitarian king in the history of the world. There have probably been many Unitarian kings, but there was a king who called himself a Unitarian and knew himself as a Unitarian. And today, this was in the 1500s, we might call him this. And I just want to read a very, very little bit about his reign from this book that the opening words came from. By almost any standard, certainly by the standards of his time, King John Sigismund was a remarkable ruler. Following the policy of his mother, he made toleration the hallmark of his reign. When he identified himself as a Unitarian and found the majority of the nation supporting him, He demanded only that those who disagreed with him live in peace with those with whom they differed. This made Transylvania one of the few places in Europe where the Reformation was carried out without bloodshed. Speaking of bloodshed, we'll cross the ocean now and come to this country. This is an image of Theodore Parker. He doesn't really look that much like a star or rock star, but he really was a rock star in his time. He was very influenced by Transcendentalism, which we'll hear more about from Larry Scogan next week. Remember Michael Servetus, who called the Trinity a pact with the devil or a doctrine of the devil? Theodore Parker called the Constitution of this country a pact with the devil because it permitted and institutionalized slavery. Theodore Parker was an abolitionist. He was involved in hiding and harboring people who were running from slavery, and he's very famous for writing sermons with a loaded pistol on his desk in case people should arrive looking for people who were running from slavery. But as much as we admire this today, in Unitarianism at the time, he was distinctly called a heretic, not because of those views on slavery and those actions on slavery, but because he challenged the Christian doctrines as well, and probably laid the groundwork for the Humanist Manifesto, which we could talk about, which came 100 years ago. Okay, let's jump again. Universalism, preaching unconditional love. So here's a little bit about what Universalists were up to. They were the first denomination to officially oppose slavery. And they had a list of 40 issues in the world that they were determined to take on, and one of them was colonialism. I think these are important histories for us. All the same, in their time, they were too radical for the mainstream abolition movement. They weren't really let in, so they started their own. So speaking of radical, Universalists were indeed the first to formally ordain a woman to the ministry, Olympia Brown. And, picture is not available, but Gloucester Dalton was an African-American man who had escaped from slavery, and he's one of the co-founders of the first Universalist church in North America. Okay, so speaking of racial justice, let's flash forward about 200 years. This is one of many famous points in time and famous photographs. As part of the civil rights movement, the Black Unitarian Universalist caucus came together. And you might imagine that with this strong history of racial justice and toleration and peacemaking and willingness to take the side that is not mainstream and not popular, that UUs really took the opportunity for justice seeking that came before them, that they would see themselves as justice seekers and they would seek justice. As a matter of fact, they so much saw themselves as justice seekers, particularly as white UUs, they didn't think they had any more work to do. So I just want to note that for us as we go forward in our own work and lives. Essentially, the Black Unitarian Universalist caucus came together and called upon the Unitarian Universalist Association to create a Black Affairs Council, something like the Gay Affairs Council that Betty Mills has talked about, to create a Black Affairs Council as a source of empowerment and support for Black UUs. And the Unitarian Universalist Association, to make a long story short, to many people of color became this. The Unitarian Universalist Association almost did and then didn't, and almost did and then didn't actually fund the Black Affairs Council adequately or put the systems in place to make it possible. And in a very heated General Assembly, many people of color walked out and never came back. Until now. This makes the Black Lives of UU movement even more important in our time. So this person here, second from the right, is Lena Gardner. She and I graduated from seminary those 2 years ago that we've been talking about. She is the first executive director of Black Lives of UU, and I was at General Assembly last year when people gathered there, raised more money for Black Lives of UU than had ever been raised for any entity ever at a General Assembly. That was our moment, and we accepted it, we took it. And Black Lives of UU went on to do things that we would hope Black Lives of UU would do, like challenge the system, challenging hiring practices, and as you may know if you're following the story, things are hot right now. So this movement has led to a proposed 8th principle. We have 7. This one is proposed. That we covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. I don't know if we'll be voting on this at Regional Assembly or at General Assembly, but I'm ready to vote. You can guess my vote. So, just briefly, before we close, I want to tell you where our 7 principles came from. If you can read, some of the authors of our 7 principles are Mrs. Nelson Burgess, Mrs. Randall Thompson, Mrs. Charles Underwood, and other women, predominantly I would say at this point probably white women because it followed the walkout of the Black Affairs Council. But they were going through, the UU Women's Federation was going through all the sexist language, wanting to change all the sexist language, and there was plenty of it. And they got to thinking, as they took more and more things out, what is our is? What are we? And they offered forward 7 principles, which were adopted by the general body in 1984. So they're pretty young, actually. And I recently decided I would put them in my own words, except for the one, free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I can't. But these are my own words for the principles. Dignity and worth, justice and compassion, support for spiritual growth, search for truth and meaning, conscience, democracy, peace, web of life. So this is no easy call to live into. So speaking of Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists, I've noticed an inconvenient tendency to make bold claims that we have to live with and live into later on. May it be so.
Our closing words are from Elizabeth Selly Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.